how did you get from one side of campus to the other? And I was just on the other side of campus and I saw you there, and now you're over here. Are you virtually everywhere? Well, I had explained to my friend, oh, you saw my identical twin. And so here I am. I'm with my identical twin brother, Jason. And I wanted to invite him on so we can talk about our experience of what it's like to be a twin. And maybe, Jason, you can tell us a little about what your experience was like growing up as a twin, too.
So lately, sometimes I forget that I'm a twin until somebody recognizes me and I have no idea who they are. And I have to say, oh, I think you must be thinking about my twin brother. Um, and sometimes, we get the looks like our neighbors, for example. Um, they did a double take when they saw you and your wife, and they were like, "What's going on?" He had a different wife and kids before.
That reminds me of when we were at church and someone came up to me and said, didn't you have a wife who was African American and a daughter who had red hair? We were like, oh, yeah, that wasn't my twin. Although someone said I could have played along with that and joked about it. So yeah, we changed classes several times. We got in trouble for it, but it was fun. I mean, if you're a twin, they all say you have to have tried it at least once.
Sometimes you forget that it's unique, but because we grow up that way, right? But there are people who often ask us questions like, "What is it like to be a twin?" And sometimes I forget, and I look at other twins, I'm like, "Oh, cool, you're a twin. What's it like to be a twin?" I'm like, "Wait a second, I'm a twin too."
What do you think our similarities and differences are?
Similarities, I think, is that we both have a hard time focusing, and we are talkative a lot of times. um, I would say our differences is that you're much more of a social butterfly. Probably, I'm more of an introvert. And you're religious. I'm an atheist. So there's, in some ways we're opposites in that regard, I'd say. But I think because we grew up the same, I don't know if it's biology or parenting, but we're both very analytical. We are both very perfectionistic. We always have to do the best in everything. That's right. And I think we both are take charge type people. You are, you like to lead out in church and school. And in my career in the IT business, I tend to lead teams of developers.
But we both have a passion for social justice, right?
Yeah.
And equality and empowering other people and seeing people regardless of what other people think, right?
Yeah. I would say we're both feminists, and we're both very impassionate about equality. There's a lot of similarities. I think a lot of it has to do with how we were raised. So it's hard to know if it's a shared family environment or if it's our genes. But you could look at, like, for example, we have obvious physical appearances that are the same, right? Yeah. And there's some things that probably are inherited as far as trait-wise. Like our dad was analytical. He was into accounting and math. I don't think he ever sat down and taught us those kinds of things. But we both naturally gravitate toward being analytical and problem solving, right? Would you agree with that? Yeah. We both have similar health issues. We both wear glasses, things like that.
So while my brother and I have a lot of similarities, we also had some differences. And sometimes those differences could contribute to some conflict and things like that growing up. Another thing is because we had so much in common, sometimes it was hard to, like, especially the way we look alike, sometimes it was hard to establish our own unique identity, right? Growing up. And so like one of the challenges as we became adults is to strike out on our own and establish and identify who are we. And that can date different girls. Yeah. And that can be challenging when your whole life experience is always the same. That really raises the question for all of us. Who are we? How much of us are we determined by our biology, and how much of us are determined by our past experiences? And at the same time, how much freedom do we have to choose who we are going to be in the present? To summarize the points that I think I take out of this is that our past experiences as well as our biology can play a role in who we are. And it's important to be able to be aware of that so that we can know how we can counteract that. So back in 1848, Phineas Gage was a construction foreman who was involved in mining. And what happened was there was an accident that blew a rod through his brain, essentially. And it was a very traumatic experience. Obviously, the doctors had to work hard to save his life, but somehow miraculously he survived. But it had a fundamental effect on his personality. So for many years afterward, he was a different person. He was impulsive, erratic. He had a hard time. He lost a job. He had a hard time maintaining jobs. Probably, who knows? It could have been from the trauma. It could also have been from the biology, the impact on his brain. But many people noticed that he was a different person. And what people learned from back in that time was that, our mind is actually a physical organ. If we damage our brains, it can have a fundamental effect on our personality. They knew enough at the time about the brain that our mind was situated there. We learned from that experience that we really need to be careful about our physical brain and look at how we can attend to that through taking care of our health. And because our brains are organs just like any other part of our body. So we're going to look today in this lesson about how our brain is affected, or our personality is affected by our biology, and also how do we classify people and their traits. So this lesson is more on the static perspective of the personality, on both the trait perspective and the biological influences on our personality. And so that's the main point of today.
The main point of our lesson today is that our personalities are a product of both nature and nurture, and both are past and present. Our biology, our family upbringing, our social interactions, and our choices all interact to make us who we are. Trauma can also cause biological injuries to our brain that can fundamentally alter our personalities. On the other hand, despite biological influences, we usually still have some choices that we can make that we are responsible for. So in this lesson, you'll be able to differentiate character, personality, and temperament. We'll look at how people have viewed personality over time. You will list modern methods of measuring personality, identify key aspects of behavioral genetics. You'll identify benefits of adoption in twin studies, and lastly, you'll identify key findings in personality research. So let's talk about personality from an overview perspective. What is the difference between character, personality, and temperament? A lot of times people use these words interchangeably, but they have different meanings. First of all, personality is the unique way individuals think, feel, and act. It's distinct from character or temperament, but it includes those terms. It is our expression of our mind. Character, on the other hand, consists of value judgments of one's morality and ethics. While some people might think of this as personality is on the outside of a person, whereas character is on the inside of a person. And some think of character as how we use our personality. Temperament, on the other hand, is one's enduring characteristics that each person is born with. So it's kind of in between. It's definitely related to personality, but we think of temperament as more enduring, whereas personality, not necessarily. So how do we usually get to know people? The way we get to know people's personalities is primarily through observation. Unless we ask, the problem is that there's only so much we can really know about people. And there's also a lot we cannot know about people. And we can only assume things about other people. So unless you ask people, but the problem with that, just asking people, is that many people will tell you what they want you to hear. And that's not necessarily always accurate. So unless we really just take time, that's the only other way really we can get to know people is through time. And that just helps us get to know people. So that helps us to understand people's personality as well. So in ancient times, people thought our emotions were situated in our bowels, which is why we refer to following our heart or our gut. So this was more the ancient ideas about personality. And so as you can see, there's this more primitive idea of what makes up our personality. And out of that, there was Hippocrates of Kos. He was the ancient Greek physician. He was the father of medicine, and he believed that behavior was controlled by those four humors, which we talked about in a previous lesson. His four humors, as you recall, include blood, yellow bile, phlegm, black bile. But he developed a system of personality temperaments that was based on these, if you recall. So the first one was the choleric temperament. This is based on the yellow bile from the liver. This is the considered was that was the one that was dominant. These people tend to be more extroverted, yet they're dominant, independent, and goal-oriented, and they can be controlling, and yet they make natural leaders. On the other hand, there's people who he believed who were had the black bile from the kidneys that dominated, and this would be the melancholic temperament. These people tend to be introverted, analytical, and deep thinkers and feelers. Now, those who have personality dominated by the red blood from the heart, this would be a sanguine temperament. And these are people who are charismatic, talkative, and socially extroverted, very outgoing people. And lastly, those who have a dominant characteristic of the phlegm humor, he believed, they would be phlegmatic. That's why that personality is called phlegmatic. It's based on the phlegm humor. And so these are people who are introverted, relaxed, quiet, and easygoing. And they're good listeners and they care about other people. So humorism has had a great influence on medicine for a century. And we think of humorism as comedy, but it's actually referring to that balance of the humors. And interestingly, ancient cultures also had similar list of classical elements. In ancient Greece, this included earth, water, air, and fire, while other cultures might refer to that as wind. Chinese philosophy has long held the theory of 5 elements, known as Wu Xing, since at least the 1st or 2nd century BC. This philosophy can be seen in Chinese traditional medicine, feng shui, astrology, and the martial arts. And these elements consist of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. It was believed that one's personality represented the dominance of one of the elements. In the medieval era, the mind was considered to have different faculties, as you may recall from previous lessons, which then this culminated in the 19th century with phrenology, the pseudoscientific idea that parts of the brain house different components of our personality. What phrenology did get correct, however, was the idea that the brain was the organ of the mind. Now let's talk about modern views of personality. Modern views of personality that stress the nature side of personality include the traits perspective and the biological perspective. These theories of personality tend to stress the role of nature in wiring our behavior, and they tend to overlook cognitive and mental processes involved in the development of personality. And those we'll look at in the next chapter. So the trait perspective looks at humans as having traits. And a trait is a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. Theorists use this approach to describe personality in order to predict behavior. Trait theorists were less interested in explaining the cause of behavior as they were in simply describing behavior. So important figures in trait theories were Allport and Cattell. Gordon Allport from 1897 to 1967 was once visit. He was an interesting character. He actually visited with Sigmund Freud in Vienna, and he tried to discuss with him an observation he made about a boy he met on the way who was obsessed with germs. And Freud asked him, "And was that little boy you?" And Allport felt that the question was overreaching and overlooked the immediate experience and conscious motivations. So he did some research on personality. He found that in the English dictionary, there are more than 4,000 words describing people's personalities. From this, he developed a list of about 200 traits, and he argued that these traits were wired into the nervous system. Now, he differentiated between cardinal traits, which were rare but strongly deterministic behavior, and central traits, which were common among all people but do not determine behavior. So cardinal strongly determines behavior, but they're rare, and central traits are common but do not determine behavior. And then lastly, there are secondary traits. These are attitudes and preferences that appear under the specific circumstances. So Raymond Cattell developed the 16PF questionnaire, which is a popular personality test, and he developed it by reducing the number of traits that he had. Remember, there was a list of about 200. Reduced that number to between 16 and 23 using a process called factor analysis. So this is Cattell, different. It sounds like Allport in the sense that they both developed the category of traits, but Cattell distinguished between surface traits and source traits. Surface traits were those that can be easily seen by other people in the outward actions of a person, whereas source traits were those basic traits that underlie the surface traits that form the core of a personality. This could be seen somewhat similar to the cardinal versus central in some sense as well. So let's look at modern perspectives on personality. More recent research supports a 5-factor model across a number of different cultures known as the Big Five. The 5-factor model of personality can be summarized with either the ocean or canoe acronyms. And you can see that in this diagram. There's openness to experience, conscientiousness, that is, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And all those are important, but we won't go into those in depth. But you can see in this chart, each of these 5 factors has a dichotomous scale. As you can see, you can be high or low on each of them, and it can go in different kinds of dimensions for each person. So just as an example, the first one is openness. So if you score low on openness, and you're more conventional and non-conforming or uncreative and down to earth, whereas someone who scores high on openness is someone who's creative, artistic, curious, and imaginative. And the other ones also have similar scales as well. So objective measures of personality are developed by trait theorists. As we're going to see, there's other types of ways people measure personality. But when people try to measure personality as if it's static, they're using a trait theory pretty much. And there's different ways that people go about measuring personalities, and that can be through behavioral assessments, through observation, interviews, and personality inventories. Behavioral assessments can be conducted through direct observation of a client in a clinical or natural setting. They typically use rating scales or frequency counts. The problem is that it could be influenced by the observer's bias, and the person knows that they're being observed and may act differently. Now, some psychoanalysts and humanistic professionals may conduct structured or unstructured interviews. However, the halo effect and observer bias can also influence assessment. However, just to be clear, psychoanalysts are not typically using a trait theory perspective. They're using a psychoanalysis perspective on personality, and that's different. That's why their methods may be more subjective, whereas people who use trait theories tend to be more objective. Objective measures of personality provide detailed description of certain personality traits. And so they are objective rather than subjective. Objective means that there are certain standards that allow the psychologist to be free of bias, whereas subjective requires the person to use their more gut intuition, in a sense, to feel out the responses. So it's a little more interpretive, whereas objective standards are less so. And there's different types of objective measures. You can see the MMPI is a popular one, the Keirsey temperament sorter, and the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which we're going to talk about next. So some challenges of personality assessments are that people lie. So lying is common, distortion, and people don't remember things or misremembering things. Those are common problems. Some personality tests include validity scales just to see if people are really honest or faking it. So they'll ask a question like, do you read the newspaper? Well, actually, that was an old one because people don't read the newspaper anymore. I think there are more modern validity scales, but they'll ask questions that just get at people's day-to-day habits. And something like, I never get angry, right? Well, if people said yes, that would be fake because everybody gets angry. And so it's testing to see if people are truly honest about themselves. Okay, so let's talk about some personality pseudoscience or pseudosciences of personality inventories. One of the most popular personality tests that has developed an almost cult-like following is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, known as the MBTI. This is devised by Catherine Cook Briggs and her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers. They based it on Carl Jung's conceptual framework of personality theory, who devised this theory based on clinical observations. Now, according to Jung's theory, there are 4 different dichotomies or scales that relate to people. And so there's 4, and if you multiply this out, this results in 16 different types. So like the Big Five, it also has these ranges. The difference is that Jung's was more theoretical, and whereas the Big Five is based on a lot more empirical research. So Jung's, you can see this is a very popular one, though, because it's very easy for people to get, and so it's still very common amongst society today. But the scales include extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and perceiving versus judging. Though the MBTI remains very popular in the world of online dating and business leadership seminars, it is many people consider it a pseudoscience because it lacks much empirical support. It has some correlations with 4 of the Big Five personality traits, Ocean, which is more commonly accepted in the field because of the Big Five has more empirical backing to it. The MBTI also lacks a validity scale to ensure honesty. It has poor validity in measuring what it purports to measure. It has poor reliability, and it lacks independence between the scales. So it's been pretty much rejected by the scientific community, even though it's still very popular today. There are thousands of online personality quizzes like BuzzFeed and Quizlets and things like that. Most of these are not scientific, but they're fun for people to do, and so that's why people do them. So personality has the theories of personalities have been strongly influenced by the theory of evolution, which we're going to look at next. Personality traits can be viewed as being developed biologically and inherited across generations. This is explained by the theory of evolution and behavioral genetics. The theory of evolution is traced to the ideas of Charles Darwin in the book The Origin of Species, and refers to the process through which species change across generations, as we talked about in the previous lesson. Natural selection, as you recall, is a theory originated by Darwin of survival of the fittest. and where better adapted individuals survive to reproduce, thereby transferring their genes to their offspring and to future generations. So that takes us to behavioral genetics next. So the study of genetics sought to understand how we inherit traits from our parents. You may recall the founder Gregor Mendel, who studied trait inheritance in the mid-19th century. And so that's interesting, since he was talking about more observable traits. We put this in the same lesson as the trait theories because, in a sense, even though we're talking about psychological traits in this lesson, the reality is that behavioral genetics looks at how psychological traits can also be inherited as well. The word genetic comes from a Greek word related to genesis, which means origin. As you can see, the Greek word genetikos means generative. And it's interesting, similar to the biblical word for Genesis, means origin. So there's a connection there between Genesis and genetics. The field of behavioral genetics seeks to quantify the relative contribution of heredity or genes and environment on individual behavior. And so, it's interesting. People oftentimes want to know, is this determined by our traits? Are our traits determined by nature or nurture? And so behavioral genetics can help determine that. And usually it's a little of both. The field was founded by Sir Francis Galton, the field of genetics, who studied pedigree of achievement in English upper class. Unfortunately, he also founded the eugenics movement, and eugenics simply means good genes, which sought to use selective breeding to improve the human species. And this movement was eventually discredited because it contributed to genocide in Nazi Germany, as we talked about in our section on pseudoscience as it relates to eugenics and scientific racism. So Sir Francis Galton, unfortunately, was, like many scientists, was caught up in that movement. As the understanding of genes advanced, the field of behavioral genetics was revived again in the 1960s and 1970s to look at how personality traits are inherited. So just to recap, Gregor Mendel was the one who started the study of genetics. Sir Francis Galton was the one who started the behavioral genetics because he's interested in the pedigree of achievement. And then it disappeared for a while, but it's been revived again to look at how personality traits are inherited. Let's look at the biological mechanisms of how we inherit traits, or genetic mechanisms. We inherit biological codes known as genes from our parents, and genes are the foundation of heredity, or what we inherit. So just so you know, historically, genes are what the original researchers of genetics looked at, but now we can look even deeper than that at the DNA. But that's why we start with the discussion of genes. What are genes? And the nucleus of the cell, here, if you look on the right of this slide, you can see how each of these are nested in the other. But the starting point is the nucleus of the cell nucleus. Such as a neuron, for example, houses the chromosomes. So if you think about a neuron, there's a cell body, and in that there's the nucleus. And in the nucleus, there's the chromosomes. And we inherit 23 single chromosomes from each parent for a total of 46 chromosomes. So here's a diagram. You can see the pink blob at the top is the cell nucleus. And inside the cell nucleus, you can see a lot of chromosomes. That's the X shapes that are in there. And then you can blow up the chromosomes and you can see how they are made up of long strands of genes. And a human body, or each of these may contain chromosomes contain about 20 to 25,000 segments, or gene segments, which are inherited from our parents. And we're going to go into that a little more next. So chromosomes, like I said, this is old information. It used to be believed about 30,000. Now I believe it's a little more narrower than that, 20 to 25,000 segments, which are inherited from our parents, like I said. Genes contain strands of DNA, which are essentially macromolecules, which is in a shape of a double helix, and these contain the codes for constructing cells. So as you can see in that diagram again, if we follow that, you can see how the chromosome can be zoomed in on, and you can see if you unwound it, you would see all these genes. And then if you zoom in on the genes, you can see these little blobs, and those are the macromolecules of the DNA. And you can unwind those macromolecules and see the double helix structure. And in that double helix structure, you can see that they're made up of base pairs of nucleotides, and those nucleotides contain chemicals like A, G, C, and T, and they all match up with each other. And those create specific instructions for the body. So researchers seek to understand how genes are arranged and how they operate to guide human development. The mapping of the human genome will contribute to our understanding of biological influences on human development. And the genome has been mapped pretty much, but research continues to go on looking at the role of these genes. Now, the looking at DNA and the mapping of the genome is actually relatively recent, but the earlier researchers did not have the advanced technology we have today. But they did have a method that allowed us to conduct research on how we inherit our traits, and those involved family studies. And family studies show some evidence that our traits are influenced by inherited genes. There's two types of family studies. There's adoption studies and twin studies. The adoption studies look at shared and non-shared environmental and genetic influences on personality. In this type of study, traits can be compared between adoptive siblings and biological siblings, or between adoptive and biological parents. A higher correlation of a trait between a child and an adoptive parent or with adoptive siblings suggests a greater environmental contribution. And that's because, if you think about it, a child and an adoptive parent do not have the same genes. So if they have a high relationship with a trait, then we can know that it's not due to the genes, but due to the environment. However, a higher correlation between a biological parent or biological siblings with a child suggests a greater genetic contribution. And so that's how that helps us to. So adopted children can help us to understand how these traits are passed on. Twin studies, like the ones I was engaged in as a twin, also can be helpful. So, but instead of comparing adopted siblings versus biological siblings, they compare monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, or identical and fraternal twins. So twin studies compare the frequencies of traits between identical twins who share 100% of the same genes with fraternal or dizygotic twins who only share about 50% of their genes, like most biological siblings do. So it's like a natural experiment, and fraternal twins are important as a control group because while they do not share 100% of the same genes, they do share the same family environment and the time of birth, which allows comparisons to be made with identical twins to look at the role that genes play. So with this kind of study, they can control for the historical time period, and they can control for family environment. But then we can compare with those who have the same DNA and those that do not. Otherwise, if you just share with another, if you just study other siblings who are not necessarily twins, then you wouldn't know if their behavior is because of their birth order. Maybe it's because they're born earlier or later, or maybe they went through different life experiences. Whereas twins who are born at the same time generally share the same kinds of life experiences because they're usually treated the same. They're usually raised about the same time, and so they usually group together. And that's the assumption. And yeah. So the concordance rate is a percentage of twins in a study who share a trait. If there's a greater concordance rate in identical twins, this would suggest a greater role of genes in contributing to individual differences in personality traits. If there's if there's a greater concordance rate or less so, then you would know that this is due to environment more than to genes. So twin studies show support for genetic influence on many personality traits such as intelligence, leadership abilities, traditionalism, nurturance, empathy, assertiveness even, neuroticism, and how extroverted people are. That's what's interesting, like traditionalism. You can see there's a genetic influence for that. So just to recap, what's the difference between an identical twin and a fraternal twin? Remember, identical twins are split from the same egg and sperm, same zygote. So that's why it's called monozygotic, one zygote. And they might have shared a placenta, but ultimately they come from the same DNA. It's cut from the same template. So when they're born, they often share the same family environment, and they have a shared birth and history, and they have 100% shared genes as well. In contrast, fraternal twins, they are independent separate eggs, two different eggs that were independently fertilized by other sperm or different sperm. And so they develop separately and they have separate placentas. And that's how people are able to determine by looking into the womb with ultrasound, they can determine what kind of twin it is by the placenta. Now, fraternal twins often share, like identical twins, they often share the same family environment, and they're born at the same time, so they share the same experiences and history. But the difference is that they only have about 50% of the same genes. So then we can know if there's a difference between them, then it's likely due to there could be genetic cause to that. Okay, so we talked a lot about the role of genes, but genes are not the only biological influence. We have non-genetic biological influences, and that could include a number of factors. So changes to our brain chemistry, for example, such as through trauma or drugs and alcohol, can also lead to changes in our personality. For example, our biology can cause us to be more aggressive. And besides genetics, the brain's emotional system, such as the amygdala and limbic systems, and the balance of neurotransmitters and the influence of alcohol can also cause us to be more aggressive. So that's just an example of how biology can influence us. So it's not always just genes. It can be our emotions and the use of substances. Those who have suffered from trauma are also at an increased likelihood of developing personality disorders. Trauma overloads the brain's ability to cope with stress, which can have an effect on one's personality. So this is it's kind of psychological, but it has a biological impact because it can affect the neurotransmitters as well and the brain's ability to cope. So let's talk about personality neuroscience next. In addition to the role of genes, the structure of our brains also have an influence on our personality. While phrenology was, of course, disproven, there are differences in brain structure associated with some aspects of the big 5 dimensions of personality that have been identified using structural MRI scans. Developmental neuroscience includes the study of brain structures associated with memory and problem solving, and in the neurological basis of personality. New brain scanning techniques are rapidly advancing work in this field. The last concept here I would want to mention is the concept of neurodiversity. This means that we should accept some differences in our personalities and the abilities of our brains as a normal part of life. Not everybody is gifted the same way. You can't expect everybody to have the same kind of brain. And that's just because even within families, there's a lot of diversity just on how people inherit their traits. And then across the human race, we have a lot of different strengths and weaknesses among people. Let's talk about some of the limitations of the nature perspective. First of all, let's look at current thoughts. According to, on trait perspective. So according to affect theorists, emotions are biologically wired into us from birth. Therefore, emotions can become entrenched in our personality. So this is an affect. What is affect theory? Affect is basically another word for emotions. It's an idea that it's biologically wired, so that's why it's called affect. So emotions can become entrenched in our personalities over time. Like if you're always a certain way, then you may become, people might describe you as that. So if you're always happy, you might be considered a happy person. If you're always sad and depressed, people might consider you a sad and depressed person. So some have described emotions such as shame as a dispositional trait, meaning it's enduring, rather than simply a temporary feeling state. And so shame can also be part of a person. So for example, some may experience more shame or shame-proneness or have internalized shame than others. And so that's one thought on the trait perspective. However, there are several limitations with the approach that looks at humans as having dispositional emotions or a emotion that's associated with them. And that's because emotions are expressed in culturally embedded ways. So, maybe certain people don't express certain kinds of emotions, but that could be because of their culture. Like some cultures, you do not express certain emotions. Also, men and women are taught to express emotions differently as well. So we have to be careful that we don't assume that people are a certain way because of the way they express their emotions. It could be cultural, and there's gender roles that also have an effect as well. And so we may want to look past that to some extent too. Emotions are also expressed in temporary states as well, as they may appear in some situations of life, but not others. So it's not all, emotions are not always a representation of an enduring quality. Like for example, if someone's going through a hard time, maybe they lost a loved one, then they may be depressed for a while, even a year. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is who they are as a person. Walter Mischel, a social cognitive theorist, believes that trait situation interaction influences how and when a personality trait will be expressed. So, like I said, it's there may be traits, but there's also the situation, and so oftentimes it's the interaction between the two, and that will affect when these personality traits are expressed. And then cross-cultural research has found support for the 5 ocean factors across cultures. However, it is unclear the degree to which child rearing practices like nurture and heredity may influence the 5 personality factors as well. So we're still not quite clear the difference between nature and nurture and the role of culture in these personalities. So you might find the traits across cultures, but we don't know exactly if that's what is it due to. So it's important to note that no personality traits have a 100% concordance. So if you remember what concordance means, that means that is inherited biologically, and that we discovered that through twin studies. Now, in other fields like medicine, you could find possibly 100% concordance. But in social sciences like psychology, you will rarely find a concordance rate that high. In fact, variations in psychological traits are about 25 to 50% inherited. This suggests that other factors also play a role in the development of traits besides genes. As I can attest as a twin, I know my brother and I are very similar in many ways, but we're also very different. And so, we have other things that play a role besides our genes. Environmental and cultural influences also count for approximately 50%. So they also play a role as well. As demonstrated, remember the Phoenix Gage story we talked about? He eventually recovered toward the end of his life, right before he passed away, unfortunately. But he recovered a lot. Maybe not completely, but he did get better. And so his personality improved to pretty much the way he was before. Although he was still blind in one eye, I think. But this shows that the brain has the power to heal. And so that's good news for people who've suffered from strokes or they've damaged their brain through drug use or something like that. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to grow and change throughout life. So it's not static. And even though brain injuries can affect our personalities, our brains are not static either. So the brain can heal from injuries and can regrow new wiring with time. And they can provide some hope for those who suffer from the effects of drugs and alcohol or from a brain injury or from stroke. We can help our brains grow and heal by paying attention to our health and lifestyle choices, such as our diet, sleep, and the way we think. Now, with that being said, obviously, it takes time. It's not something you want to intentionally inflict on your brain. But if you do find yourself suffering from damage to your brain, there's at least some hope that you might be able to heal it back with time.
Personality tests are very common today, especially in the realms of dating, leadership, hiring, things like that. It's very common, very popular. People want to know what personality they are. People go online to these websites and find out if they're a Luke or a Leia, or if they are what kind of Harry Potter character they are. And there's been some very popular personality tests. Unfortunately, some of them are not always very rigorously based on science. Many of them are pseudoscientific. In fact, a lot of times we just see what we want to see in some of these things. When we read the description, we think, oh, that's me, but that same description could apply to a lot of people. So the reality is that personality tests, as fun as they may be, are not always based on rigorous scientific testing, although some are better than others. Another thing we've already talked about is the role of biology. Biology has an important effect on our personalities, but it's also important to remember that it does not predetermine who we are, because as much as our biology and genes can influence our behavior, at the end of the day, we still have choices and we can still choose how we're going to be. And so there's a combination, and not just our choices, but there's this combination of nature and nurture. Sometimes our past experiences also have an effect on how we're going to be. And so we don't want to blame just our biology either. We're not doomed to repeat our parents' mistakes, for example. Our biology is not destiny. We still have choices we can make, which is good news. We can overcome and we can try to create new behaviors. Although some things are genetic and some things are biological that may not be able to overcome, such as a disease or illness that's transmitted, and that may be lifelong and hereditary. So we don't necessarily want to always assume that just because we have a biological propensity that we are doomed necessarily either. And there are things we can do to help. So that takes us to this discussion on spirituality next. We're going to look at a spiritual perspective on human nature next.
Every time we hear of a mass shooting, usually there's a debate about gun control, and then people seek to find some explanations for the crimes. The news media often turns their attentions to mental illness, and many people, when they think about crimes, are tempted to excuse the crimes based on mental illness. In fact, there seems to be a growing trend to justify serious crimes based on some psychiatric condition. Who knows what that agenda is? Maybe it's because they want to support guns or they don't want to. But oftentimes people look to mental illness to blame these crimes on. But let's stop blaming violent crimes and mass shootings on mental illness. This tendency to blame mental illness is based on two false assumptions. The first false assumption is that because mental illness is rooted in biological defects, that it means that their actions are beyond their control and thus they're less responsible for the crime. However, very rarely do mental illnesses force anyone to do something that they do not want to do. The second false assumption is that there is a correlation between mental illness and violence. However, the empirical evidence does not support this. Many people suffer from the effects of abuse and mental illness in their lives, but they do not go out and kill people. Otherwise, we would have a lot more violence in our society than we do. So, people need to be held responsible for their choices. In his book, The Biology of Sin, Dr. Mark Stanford, a Christian neuroscientist, writes, "I have seen the dark side of humanity." He's interviewed convicted rapists and murderers. And he continues, "What has struck me over the years, however, is how ordinary these individuals are. People who have done very evil things are more like you and me than we may want to admit. Most have dreamed of better lives for themselves and desperately want to change, but they don't know how. When we pretend that evil people are very different from us, it makes it easier to judge them while giving us a false sense of security that we would never do such a thing. It also helps us to avoid responsibility for how we might be contributing as a society to these wrongs. However, when we realize that all of us are capable of evil, then there are few excuses for wrong behavior, as sin as Christians call it." So let's talk about behavioral genesis. Every one of us has biological propensities to do the wrong things in life. In the Bible, there's the idea that sin gets passed down from generation to generation. And as I was saying before, it's interesting that the word genetics comes from a word related to the Greek genesis, meaning origin. The Genesis creation story recounts how the world was created perfectly, but because of the introduction of sin, the world has inherited a broken and dying nature. Now, according to the Genesis story, Adam and Eve were both created as perfect beings and given the freedom of choice to choose to eat from the tree of knowledge or not. After they sinned, both tried to claim that they had no choice but to sin. And Adam said he did not have any choice because the woman you put here with me, he said, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. And thus Adam tried to blame God by suggesting that he had not really given Adam any choice, thereby putting the responsibility on God. Eve also tried to say that she did not have any choice because the serpent deceived me. Now, both were somewhat correct, and so God condemned the serpent, even though God still cursed Adam and Eve anyway. Neither of them had fully taken responsibility for their freely chosen decisions. They tried to blame God or Satan, anybody but themselves. These are excuses. Humans have blamed God, Satan, or biology for their actions all throughout history. You recall the phrase, "the devil made me do it." It's practically cliche. In the courts of law, we hear defendants blaming their upbringing or their brain hormones. Even in the realm of theology, we hear people blame God, such as the act of God predestining someone to heaven or hell can be used as a crutch to avoid personal responsibility. Or we blame Adam and Eve, saying our total depravity is all their fault. We cannot help ourselves because of what Adam did. Why do we blame ourselves? Why do we blame others or our biology for our wrong actions rather than simply just taking responsibility? If we want to see how sin is inherited, a natural experiment would be to look at the first twin study in Genesis 4 and of Cain and Abel immediately after the fall. Some suggest that Cain and Abel were twin brothers. It's not quite clear, but the word for conceived is mentioned once before Cain's birth and not before Abel's, and the birth is mentioned practically at the same time. Regardless, Cain and Abel appear to have similar birth conditions and the same upbringing as sons of Adam and Eve. In other words, they had the same nature and nurture. Yet, both had different life paths. One decided to be a shepherd, while the other decided to be a farmer. Regardless of whether Cain and Abel were twins or not, genetically identical twins have often been used by scientists and philosophers to show how nature and nurture have an influence on our life choices. As one myself, I know from personal experience that twins have often end up being very similar because of their upbringing. However, even twins who have been separated at birth demonstrate an uncanny similarity in their life paths. Both nature and nurture have a far more powerful influence on our life choices than many people realize. However, even as we are very identical in many ways, my twin and I are also very different. We still make our own choices in life, even regarding spirituality. The story of Cain and Abel show us how these brothers made a choice about how they would worship God. Both Cain and Abel had brought a sacrifice to God. This sacrifice seems to be a free will offering, since there's no record of God asking them for a sacrifice. But even though both brought an offering, God preferred Abel's gift because it was an act of faith. We're told that Abel brought the finest portion of his firstborn animal, while Cain merely brought some of the fruits of the soil. So Abel's offering demonstrated a greater sacrifice of faith, while Cain's did not demonstrate much faith. And Abel's gift was a slaughtered animal, which really shows us that Abel had an understanding of God's plan of salvation and how dependent on this system of sacrifice to cover him. It would take faith to shed the blood of an animal that he cared for, and it took humility to recognize his dependence on something other than himself to be right with God. And God was not arbitrary toward Cain. God even told him, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" And that implies that Cain knew what God had wanted. Cain made a conscious choice that reflected an inner attitude. The story teaches us that God judges us based on our inner attitudes. The actual act is not as important as the attitude, since we're told that God showed favor on not merely the offering, but on Abel himself. God might have winked at Cain's ignorance if Cain was truly repentant and wanting to please God. Yet Cain's outward reaction of anger showed his inward state of rebellion. Why did Cain not seek to please God? Who knows? Perhaps Cain thought his own way was better, or perhaps his worship was not from the heart. Either way, his act revealed that he had his murdering of his brother revealed that he had some reservations about God. The doubt was a seed for his rebellion. So what is sin? Sin has been, there's many words used to describe sin in the Bible's original languages, but they can be grouped around at least 10 basic root words. And these words for sin can refer to any part of the sin process. There's the condemnation that results from the failure, either intentional or unintentional. Then there's the natural human depravity. There's shame, blame, or separation that results from wrong behavior. There's fear, doubt, or lack of faith that helps perpetuate the cycle. Or there's the entire enslaving sin cycle itself. So Cain murdered his brother out of jealousy and anger. Before Cain did this, God warned him, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." This is from Genesis 4:7. And it's a good description of the conflict all of us face against our own natural propensities and how we must rule over it. Stanford, in his book, The Biology of Sin, writes, "Sin is a ruthless beast, crouching at the door, waiting to consume us all. And when we encounter those whom it has overcome, we should feel sorrow rather than a self-righteous pride." It's a good warning to think about. When we realize that any of us are capable of sin, it also calls us to be more compassionate and less judgmental of people who err. It reminds me of what Ellen White writes on the same subject. She writes, "God wants us to help one another by a manifestation of sympathy and unselfish love. There are those who have inherited peculiar tempers and dispositions. They may be hard to deal with, but are we faultless? They are not to be discouraged. Christ pities and helps those who err in judgment. He has suffered death for every man, and because of this, he has a touching and profound interest in every man." So how does sin affect our human nature? The answer to this question impacts our view of how God saves us. For example, are we so stuck in sin that we need grace to rescue us without any effort on our part? Or do we have enough free will that we should have some part to play in our salvation? At what point do humans need to put in some effort, or should they sit back and do nothing? Over time, humans became more and more corrupt until God destroyed the world in a flood. In the story of Noah, as you recall, God gives his opinion about human nature. He says, the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. The idea that humans are innately evil from infancy has been around since at least the days of St. Augustine. So let's talk about Augustine. Augustine of Hippo was in the 300s AD. He was a Christian convert who, through his own personal life struggles, believed that humans are naturally corrupt to the core, and thus he taught total depravity. He certainly felt that humans had no natural ability to follow whatever they willed to do. And he reacted strongly to Pelagius. As a side note, Pelagius was teaching at his time. At that time, he taught that anybody could just choose to stop sinning if they wanted to. Thankfully, it was Pelagius's ideas were condemned as heresy because it really did away with the need for Christ. And Augustine argued that no, we can't just simply stop sinning any time we want because we are depraved at the core. That's what he taught. And we went into another extreme, which we're going to look at, but that's who he was reacting to. We have to understand the historical context. Augustine expounded on the concept of original sin. He was not the originator of it. The term original sin is so called because our sins stem from the sins of our first ancestors, Adam and Eve. And our parents influence their children through genetically encoding their own character and patterns of behavior. Ellen White writes, what the parents are, that to a greater extent the children will be. The physical conditions of the parents, their dispositions and appetites, their mental and moral tendencies are to a greater or less degree reproduced in their children. So Ellen White summarizes the biblical teaching of the fallen nature we inherit. She says, through the successive generations since the fall, the tendency has been continually downward. Disease has been transmitted from parents to children, generation after generation. Even infants in the cradle suffer from afflictions caused by the sins of their parents. And we know that. If you have children who are born to addicted parents, they're unfortunately oftentimes suffering immediately. So it's important to remember our broken nature. Stanford reminds us that unless we understand the depths of our sinful nature, we are likely to slide into a legalistic, works-based religion, which is where Pelagius erred. He writes, we talk like sinful behavior is so easy to overcome. That's what Pelagius did, right? But the reality is that sin is pervasive and deeply ingrained in us. A few Bible verses and a quick prayer are not going to result in a life of sinless perfection. So we advise our brothers and sisters in the church to suppress and or avoid sinful lusts and desires in an attempt to be godly. Unfortunately, this works-based approach to behavior change ultimately results in frustration and failure. We have to find a deeper strategy that's going to change us. So in opposition to Pelagius, Augustine clarified his understanding of Romans 7 and applied Paul's struggle with sin to the life of the converted Christian to show that even Christians constantly struggle with their depraved nature. Paul confessed that even as a Christian, he says, I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. You recall, that was what Paul said. It's very similar to Augustine's approach. And so it's good to remember it's important to remember our broken nature. However, unfortunately, Augustine's teaching is taken to an extreme a lot. Augustine not only taught that humans are born with a tendency to sin, but that we are born as sinners, or born as sinners. Therefore, we inherit the guilt of our forefathers. And with this idea sometimes being derided as original guilt. Now, there seems to be some suggestions of this in the Bible. King David seemed to suggest that we're born guilty. He said, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. However, David never said that he was born a guilty sinner or spiritually dead. It seems that since the poem was not intended to be a technical discussion on original sin, that David was referring primarily to the practical aspects of having a corrupted nature and the virtual inevitability of being a sinner. Are we guilty of sin even before we commit an act of sin simply because of our inherited depravity? The Bible seems to suggest, it seems to support that idea, make some interesting ideas. You recall Exodus says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So original guilt says that we're condemned just for being born. And because of this belief in original guilt, Augustine supported and encouraged infant baptism. And if they thought that if a newborn died before he had a chance to be converted, the baby was going to go to hell. And this idea is still practiced in the Catholic Church and other denominations today. Because our human nature is corrupted, Augustine believed that we no longer have free will. So since our will is not free but bound by sin, there's nothing we can do to choose salvation. Therefore, God must choose his elected people and somehow energize their will to accept his grace. Therefore, Augustine introduced the idea of predestination, and that salvation extends to those that God elects or chooses. Now, this sounds somewhat extreme to some Protestants today, but Augustine's teachings were a necessary corrective to all the legalism that arose from Pelagianism. And after many centuries of legalism, it was Martin Luther's rediscovery of Augustine's teaching that sparked Protestant Reformation. The problem with all this is that with Augustine's idea of original sin is that it tends to deny personal responsibility. We can't be held guilty for having bad genes. Rather we're guilty for conscious choices that we made. And indeed, every individual is unique in terms of the interactions between his or her environment, and decisions that should be made on an individual basis and flexibility as a key cognitive capacity must be a key component in our moral and legal decision making. This is by Gold and Applebaum. So perhaps a problem with Augustine's teaching on the subject was that he went to the extreme of original guilt by saying that we're born guilty. Would God actually punish children for the sins of their parents while also claiming to be forgiving? It doesn't make any sense. The Bible explicitly prohibits us from punishing people for other people's sins, so it seems contradictory. So I think it's important to differentiate between a sinful nature and a sinful man. And we can have a sinful nature, and we know that we inherit, propensities, like addictive patterns are inherited. But that doesn't necessarily mean we are guilty. Sinful man or sinful human beings means that we are guilty for sin. So there's a difference between having a nature that is bent towards sin and actually sinning. It's an important distinction. So in the story, Cain acted out on his anger and he killed his brother. But Cain did not have any excuses. He is, just as they both made their choices to decide on how they would sacrifice, he made his own choice to kill his brother. He couldn't blame his DNA or his parents or anything like that. Both had choices and both were morally responsible for it. So all of us have the same capacity to trust God or doubt God, regardless of the way we're born or raised. So Stanford writes that biology is not destiny. When we fully understand the effects of original sin on our physical bodies, it becomes clear that broken biology can never be used as an excuse for sinful behavior. The fact that we have sinful DNA is simply another example of why we so desperately need a Savior with the power to completely recreate us. The other thing is that the good news that good things can come from flawed people. We know in the story that even after Adam and Eve sinned, they had more children, and it says Eve says that God granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him. And Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. And at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. It's interesting that it seems that Eve recognized that her new child was um, a blessing, and she felt that perhaps it was their fault, maybe for why they were all in a mess. But it's important to remember that the good things, like this passage also tells us that despite all that happened, people began to call on the name of the Lord, and that's good news because despite their background, good things can come from bad people. That's an important lesson that I had to learn in my own life as a therapist. I've learned that human beings are not all good or all evil, sinners are all holy. One of the discoveries I needed to make in my life was the realization that people who hurt me were not all completely all bad. There are some good things about them too. And when we pigeonhole people into stark categories, it makes it hard for us to forgive them. So people are complex, and we need to look at them as that. There's good in everybody. That's a good thing to remember. Genesis says when God created mankind, he made him in the likeness of God. And so the first humans were created in God's image. This is important to remember because sin is not the only thing that defines us. And when we realize how we're all different, we all have different abilities, it helps us to remember how we find true unity in this world. Ellen White writes this: in our association with one another, we're to remember that all have not the same talents or the same disposition. Let us remember that some can fill certain positions more successfully than others. That reminds me of the last thing I want to end on is the Apostle Paul writes about spiritual gifts and how we can find unity in our differences. So he talks about spiritual gifts. It comes from the word grace gifts. And they're gifts, essentially, that are bestowed by God to us for the purpose of fulfilling his mission on this earth. And there's some passages where he lists these different gifts that we all have. And so you can see there's, and so if you think about it like the personality inventories that you can do, there are spiritual gifts tests, and we all have different gifts that we may have. But from a spiritual perspective, these are things that are spiritually given to us. So for Paul, the purpose of recognizing that we all have these different gifts was mainly just to promote the unity in the work and how God works through people in different ways. So everyone is of equal importance in how they contribute to the ministry of God. Just because one person may be more visible in church or more popular does not mean that they're more valuable. And this reminds me, just as a last illustration, I was once involved in a ministry, and we did a little test to see how people were connected. So we run this analysis, like this diagram I have here. It was called a social network analysis, where we wanted to find out how people were connected to each other. And we found that, it wasn't the most important people in the group were not necessarily the ones who were up front or the ones who were always talking or the most vocal people, but they were the connectors, the people who were quiet sometimes, but invited others to join them. And I think that's a really important lesson. That was an important lesson for me. It made me realize that, we're all important in different ways. Some people might be more visible, but that doesn't mean they're more important than those who may be quieter, but hold the group together and act as a glue. And that's similar to what Paul was saying, that just as one body, he says, just as a body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For all baptized by one Spirit, so we form one body. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but many. So he's saying that, basically, that we all have different parts, we all have different functions, but we're all part of the same body. And then he says, basically, just to summarize, would one part say that they're more important, or that maybe one part shouldn't belong or doesn't belong? And should one part of the body say to the other, we don't need you? No, every part works together to form a whole. Every part is important. And that's an important reminder for each of us that, we may all have different gifts and different abilities, but we're all very important. We all play a different role, and each of us are equally valuable and important. And we shouldn't put one person as over the other as more important just because they happen to be more vocal or visible or have more power. Everybody in God is of equal importance to him. We all can serve a purpose. So that's my hope. When we realize how we're all gifted differently, it helps us to see how all people are unique and inherently valuable and celebrate our differences. In addition, while biology is a great influence on our behavior, it also does not condemn us to a particular path in life either. We all have the ability to choose to some extent as well. So that's some things to think about. Anyway, that's the lesson for today. And I hope you can join us as we continue on in the discussion of how our past experiences shape who we are in chapter 7. Why am I this way?